It was a cold January morning in the year 1917. There was a silent transmission of a message somewhere in the international diplomatic machinery that crossed the Atlantic. It was not written in an inflammatory style. It did not contain a declaration of war. It did not make any threats of invasion in broad brushstrokes. It was a strategic plan that was penned in careful words and coded for secrecy. But history isn't always about bangs or speeches. Sometimes it's about paper. About ink. About a few lines of type that pass unnoticed by the individuals who feel they are in control of history. This telegraph would never pass unnoticed at its destination. So, when this issue came to the forefront, it would lead the United States towards a war that it had been trying to avoid for over 2 years. By the start of 1917, the First World War had been raging for more than 2 years. Europe was bleeding itself dry in trenches that stretched from the North Sea to the Swiss border. Verdun had become synonymous with industrial slaughter. The Somme had erased entire regiments in a single morning. Empires were still standing, but they were hollowing out from within. Across the Atlantic, the United States watched. President Woodrow Wilson had been re-elected only months earlier on a slogan that resonated deeply with an exhausted public: "He kept us out of war." For many Americans, the conflict in Europe felt distant, tragic, and unnecessary. The nation was built on the belief that it could avoid the old world cycles of bloodshed. Neutrality, however, was never as clean as it sounded. American factories supplied the Allies with food, steel, ammunition, and credit. American banks were deeply entangled with British and French war financing. German leaders noticed. German submarines noticed even more. The Atlantic Ocean had become a battlefield without trenches. British blockades restricted German trade, slowly strangling the German economy. In response, Germany turned to its most effective asymmetric weapon, the U-boat. Submarines prowled shipping lanes, attacking merchant vessels without warning. The logic was ruthless. Sink enough ships, starve Britain into submission, and end the war. The problem was that many of those ships carried American goods, and sometimes, American lives. In 1915, the sinking of the Lusitania shocked the United States. Nearly 1,200 people died, including 128 Americans. Outrage surged. Germany temporarily pulled back, issuing pledges to restrict submarine warfare. But by late 1916, Germany's position was worsening. The war of attrition favored the Allies, whose combined industrial and colonial resources dwarfed Germany's own. On the Eastern Front, Russia was weakening, but not yet out. On the Western Front, Germany was stuck in place. German leaders faced a brutal calculation. If they resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, they might provoke the United States into joining the war. But if they didn't, they were likely to lose anyway. In January 1917, they chose the gamble. The German High Command believed time was running out. Admiral Henning von Holzendorf, head of the German Admiralty, argued that unrestricted submarine warfare could force Britain to surrender within 6 months. American intervention, he believed, would come too late to matter. The United States, he insisted, lacked the trained army, the logistics, and the political unity to intervene decisively before Britain collapsed. It was a wager built on optimism and miscalculation. On January 9, 1917, Kaiser Wilhelm II approved the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare. Starting February 1, any ship, neutral or not, found in designated war zones would be sunk without warning. German diplomats knew what this meant. The United States would likely sever relations. War was a real possibility. And if America entered the conflict, Germany would face a fresh, powerful enemy with enormous industrial potential. Berlin searched for ways to offset that risk. That search led south. At the German Foreign Office, the responsibility for managing this risk fell to Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann. He was not a firebrand. He was a bureaucrat. Precise, cautious, methodical. He understood the stakes. Zimmermann knew Germany could not fight the United States directly across the Atlantic. But perhaps it didn't have to. If America could be distracted, if its attention could be pulled closer to home, its ability to project power overseas would be limited. That distraction already existed, simmering just beyond America's southern border. Mexico. Relations between the United States and Mexico were tense. The Mexican Revolution had plunged the country into chaos. American troops had crossed into Mexican territory in 1916 during the pursuit of Pancho Villa. Resentment lingered. Trust was thin. Zimmermann saw an opening. If Mexico could be persuaded to align with Germany in the event of an American entry into the war, it could tie down U.S. forces on their own continent. Better still, it could reopen old wounds. Texas, New Mexico, Arizona. Territories lost by Mexico decades earlier. The idea was audacious, risky, perhaps unrealistic. But in January 1917, Germany was running out of safe options.
So Zimmermann dictated a message.
On January 16, 1917, the German Foreign Office sent an encoded telegram to the German ambassador in Washington. From there, it was to be forwarded to Mexico City.
The message proposed a secret alliance.
If the United States entered the war against Germany, Mexico would declare war on the United States. In return, Germany would provide financial support and back Mexico's efforts to reclaim the territories it had lost. Zimmermann also suggested Mexico might reach out to Japan, inviting it to join the alliance. According to historical records, the tone of the telegram was calm, almost clinical. It did not insult the United States. It did not rage against American policy. It simply laid out a contingency plan. The assumption behind it was simple and fatal. The message would remain secret. Zimmermann believed German codes were secure. That belief was misplaced. Unbeknownst to Berlin, British intelligence had been intercepting and decrypting German communications for years. At the center of this effort was Room 40, a shadowy division of the British Admiralty dedicated to code-breaking. When the telegram crossed the Atlantic, it passed through British-controlled cables. It was intercepted almost immediately. The codebreakers went to work. At first, they could hardly believe what they were reading. Here was proof, direct, unambiguous, that Germany was plotting against the territorial integrity of the United States.
It was a gift, a political weapon,
but also a dangerous one. If Britain revealed it too quickly, Germany might realize its codes were compromised. If Britain revealed it clumsily, the United States might suspect a forgery designed to manipulate American opinion.
The British waited.
They needed a way to expose the message without exposing themselves. By late February, the British had devised a plan. They would claim the telegram had been intercepted in Mexico, not at sea. That explanation would protect their code-breaking capabilities while delivering the message intact to Washington. On February 24, 1917, British officials quietly handed the decoded telegram to the American ambassador in London. Within days, it reached President Wilson. Wilson read it carefully. Then he read it again. The message did not threaten immediate invasion. It did not guarantee success. But it shattered the remaining illusion that Germany viewed the United States as a neutral party to be respected. This was not collateral damage. This was strategy. On March 1, 1917, the contents of the telegram were published in American newspapers. The reaction was immediate.
Anger swept the country.
Skepticism evaporated. Even many isolationists were stunned. The idea that a foreign power had encouraged a neighboring nation to attack the United States struck at something primal.
Crowds gathered.
Editorials erupted. Politicians who had urged caution found themselves suddenly out of step with public sentiment. And then, in a moment that stunned even his allies, Arthur Zimmermann confirmed the telegram was real. He did not apologize. He did not retract it. He simply stated that it had been a legitimate diplomatic communication under wartime conditions. For many Americans, that admission settled the question. Germany had crossed a line. The Zimmermann telegram did not declare war. But it made war unavoidable. Within weeks, German submarines were sinking American ships at an accelerating rate. American sailors were dying. Neutrality had become an empty word. On April 2, 1917, President Wilson stood before Congress and asked for a declaration of war. He framed it not as vengeance, but as necessity. The world, he said, must be made safe for democracy. 4 days later, the United States entered the First World War. The telegram had done its work. But the deeper story does not end there. Because the Zimmermann telegram was not just a provocation. It was a window into how modern war operates, through systems, miscalculations, and messages sent under the assumption that no one is listening. We will follow what happened next, how America mobilized, how Mexico reacted, and how a single intercepted message reshaped the balance of a global war. When the Zimmermann telegram reached the American public, it detonated far beyond the corridors of diplomacy. Its words did not only accuse Germany of hostility but reframed the war itself. Up until then, it was remote and tragic, a debatable conflict. After March 1917, it would be personal. But the most immediate effect of the telegram was not on the battlefield. It was psychological. America had not been attacked on its own soil. Yet for the first time, Americans could clearly see themselves as a target. Before the telegram, the American public was divided. Ethnic ties mattered. German Americans feared discrimination, Irish Americans distrusted Britain, and many farmers and workers saw no reason to sacrifice their sons for European empires. The Zimmermann telegram cut through that complexity. It spoke in a language Americans understood: territory, sovereignty, and threat. The idea that Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona could be bargaining chips in a foreign power strategy struck a nerve that abstract discussions of submarine warfare never had. Newspapers ran banner headlines: Political cartoons depicted Germany as a scheming puppet master. Public meetings that once argued neutrality now debated preparedness. Wilson did not rush. He understood the power of timing. The telegram alone was not enough to justify war. But it prepared the ground. It changed the emotional climate in which decisions would be made. Meanwhile, events elsewhere were accelerating. On February 1, 1917, Germany formally resumed unrestricted submarine warfare. The policy had been announced. Now it was being enforced. Within weeks, American ships were being sunk in the Atlantic.
The Housatonic, the Algonquin. Others followed. Crews were lost.
Survivors arrived with stories of sudden explosions and lifeboats drifting in cold seas. German calculations had assumed American outrage would be loud but slow.
They were wrong.
Shipping insurance rates soared. American ports buzzed with rumors and anger. Navy planners dusted off contingency plans that had existed mostly on paper.
Still, Wilson hesitated.
He believed war should be the last resort. He also believed the United States needed moral clarity, not just strategic justification. The telegram provided that clarity. Lost amid the fury in Washington was an uncomfortable truth. Mexico never intended to accept Germany's proposal. The Mexican government, led by President Venustiano Carranza, examined the telegram carefully. According to historical records, Carranza ordered a military assessment of the idea of reclaiming lost territories.
The assessment was blunt.
Mexico lacked the military capacity to fight the United States. Its economy was shattered by years of revolution. Its army was divided and poorly equipped. Even with German financial support, victory was implausible.
And then there was Japan.
Zimmermann had suggested Mexico invite Japan to join the alliance. This proposal betrayed a profound misunderstanding of geopolitics. Japan was already aligned with Britain. It had no interest in antagonizing the United States over Mexico. Carranza quietly declined. No dramatic response was sent.
No public outrage. Mexico chose silence.
But by then, it didn't matter. The telegram's purpose had never been to convince Mexico. It had been to frighten America. Why did Zimmermann confirm the telegram's authenticity? Historians still debate this moment. Some argue he believed honesty would blunt outrage. Others suggest he underestimated American reaction. Zimmermann himself later claimed he did not see the proposal as aggressive, but defensive. This was a fatal misreading. German leaders viewed diplomacy as a chessboard. They assumed rational calculation would prevail. What they failed to grasp was that the United States was not reacting as a strategist. It was reacting as a nation that felt deceived.
The telegram stripped away ambiguity.
It transformed Germany from an abstract belligerent into a plotting adversary. And once that transformation occurred, political resistance collapsed. By late March 1917, Wilson's cabinet was split no longer over whether America would enter the war, but how. Wilson himself framed the coming conflict in moral terms.
This was not a war for conquest, he argued.
It was a war to defend international norms.
Neutral shipping.
National sovereignty. The principle that powerful states could not coerce weaker ones through secret threats. Behind the language lay harsher realities. American industry was already aligned with the Allies. American credit was already exposed. American security was already compromised. The telegram did not create these conditions.
It exposed them.
On April 2, 1917, Wilson addressed Congress. The chamber was silent. He spoke slowly, deliberately, invoking a world made safe for democracy. He referenced submarine warfare. He referenced threats. He did not dwell on the telegram. He did not need to. Everyone in the room knew what had changed. 4 days later, Congress declared war on Germany. The United States had crossed the threshold. Germany had gambled that America could not mobilize in time.
Again, they were wrong.
Though the U.S. Army was small in 1917, American industrial capacity was vast.
Shipyards expanded.
Factories retooled. Millions of men registered for the draft. Training camps sprang up across the country. But this transformation was not immediate. In the early months, America's contribution was psychological more than military. Its entry reassured Britain and France. It signaled to Germany that the war would not end quickly.
Morale shifted.
On the German side, doubts crept in. The submarine campaign continued, but its promised decisive effect failed to materialize.
Britain endured.
The Atlantic, once a German hunting ground, became increasingly dangerous for U-boats as American naval forces joined the fight. The gamble was unraveling. The Zimmermann telegram did not win the war for the Allies, but it altered its trajectory. It demonstrated how modern conflict operates beneath the surface.
How intelligence, communication networks, and perception can outweigh battlefield maneuvers.
How a single intercepted message can collapse years of careful neutrality. Most importantly, it revealed the fragility of assumptions. Germany assumed secrecy.
Britain assumed patience. America assumed distance. All were wrong.
The war was no longer confined to Europe.
It had become global.
And in the months ahead, the consequences of that shift would be felt not just in trenches, but in politics, society, and the future shape of the world. We will follow the aftermath, how America's entry reshaped the battlefield, how Germany struggled to adapt, and how the quiet telegram became one of history's loudest turning points. America's entry into the First World War was not an act that shook the world with marching troops and formation-sailing fleets across the Atlantic Ocean. America's entry was quiet, administrative, and uneven. However, something irrevocable was already underway in the background. America had long been committed to its policy of non-interference and There was a new center of gravity in the war. But what ensued was neither the sudden collapse of German resistance nor the swift Allied victory. Rather, the war was bent, gradually at first, then irrevocably, by the might of American power. Germany had been wrongly estimating America's response. But it had misunderstood America itself. In April 1917, the U.S. had a professional army smaller than that of Portugal. Its officers had experience, but not many. Its military training philosophy was antiquated. Its artillery reserves were meager. Its logistical organization had never been tried on a scale necessary during modern warfare. On paper, America looked unprepared. In reality, it was something far more dangerous.
It was unfinished.
The American Expeditionary Forces, or AEF, would not be a mere supplement to British and French armies. President Wilson and General John J. Pershing insisted on this point relentlessly. America would fight under its own command. Its soldiers would not be used simply as replacements to refill exhausted Allied units. This decision frustrated Allied commanders desperate for manpower. But Pershing understood something they did not. If America was to shape the peace, it had to shape the war. Pershing arrived in France in June 1917. He toured the front lines, spoke with Allied generals, and observed trench warfare firsthand.
What he saw disturbed him.
He believed the Western Front had become trapped in its own logic, an endless cycle of artillery bombardment and infantry sacrifice. He feared that if American troops were absorbed into this system too quickly, they would lose initiative before they gained experience. Pershing advocated open warfare.
Movement, maneuver, aggression.
His views clashed with the hard-earned lessons of British and French commanders who had watched entire armies shredded by machine guns and shellfire.
Both sides were right, and both were wrong.
America would learn the realities of industrial war the same way everyone else had, by paying for them. While American forces trained, shipped and assembled, Germany watched with growing unease. The submarine campaign, intended to force Britain's surrender before American mobilization could matter, was failing. Convoys reduced losses.
New anti-submarine technologies improved detection.
American destroyers patrolled Atlantic lanes. The math was changing. Germany still held formidable positions in France and Belgium. Its army remained disciplined and lethal.
But it was bleeding.
Manpower shortages worsened. Food shortages at home became critical. Civilian morale deteriorated under blockade and exhaustion. And now, there was an end date. Not a calendar date, a demographic one. Every month, more Americans arrived. When American troops finally entered combat in meaningful numbers in 1918, European observers noticed something immediately.
They were different.
American soldiers were better fed. Their uniforms were cleaner. Their equipment, while sometimes unfamiliar, was plentiful. Most strikingly, they carried an air of optimism that bordered on naivete. They believed the war could still be won decisively. European veterans had long abandoned that illusion. This optimism would not survive first contact. But for a brief moment, it mattered. Morale surged among Allied troops. French civilians cheered American columns. British officers spoke openly of renewed hope. Germany noticed too. Captured documents and later memoirs reveal a growing fear among German commanders that the war had entered its final phase, and not in their favor. Germany's response was desperate. In March 1918, it launched the Kaiserschlacht, the spring offensive. This was Germany's last, best chance to win the war before American strength became overwhelming. Using stormtrooper tactics, infiltration, and concentrated artillery, German forces broke through Allied lines in places where trench warfare had long stagnated. For weeks, they advanced farther than at any time since 1914. Paris was threatened again. The world held its breath. But the offensive carried a fatal flaw. It lacked sustainability. German logistics could not keep up.
Units outran supply lines. Casualties mounted.
The best troops were expended first, and the Americans were arriving. American troops first experienced large-scale combat at places like Cantigny, Belleau-Wood, and Château-Thierry. At Belleau-Wood, U.S. Marines faced German machine gun nests in dense forest terrain. Casualties were horrific. Commanders ordered frontal assaults that echoed the worst mistakes of earlier years.
The Marines held, at enormous cost.
German officers reportedly referred to them as Teufelshund, devil dogs, a testament to their tenacity more than their tactics. But beneath the heroism lay a grim truth. America was learning the same lessons everyone else had learned. Modern war did not reward bravery alone.
It demanded adaptation.
What ultimately set America apart was not its soldiers. It was its factories. American shipyards launched vessels faster than German U-boats could sink them. Railroads moved men and material with industrial efficiency. Food production stabilized Allied supplies. Credit and loans sustained governments on the brink of collapse. War had become a contest of systems, and America's system was unmatched. Germany had no answer to this. By mid-1918, the balance tipped irreversibly. Allied counteroffensives pushed German forces back along the Western Front. American divisions, now better trained and integrated, participated in large-scale operations like the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, the largest battle in U.S. military history. Losses were severe, but momentum favored the Allies. Inside Germany, unrest grew.
Sailors mutiniert.
Workers struck. Political authority weakened. The war was being lost not just at the front, but at home. Looking back, historians would note that the Zimmermann telegram did not defeat Germany, but it removed America's hesitation. It turned distance into engagement, debate into decision. It ensured that when Germany gambled everything on the spring offensive, it was already too late. The war's outcome was no longer uncertain. Only its cost remained to be determined. We will examine how the war ended, how Germany collapsed from within, and how the quiet telegram's consequences echoed into the peace, and into the conflicts that followed. It did not lose the First World War in the manner wars were supposed to be lost. They did not experience the final battle where the armies were completely destroyed. They did not see enemy soldiers marching victoriously through the streets of Berlin. They did not experience the unconditional surrender signed at gunpoint. It collapsed instead of
Quietest first, then, abruptly,
and finally, totally. In order to understand how this came about, and the danger of the implications, we must move our focus from the trenches to the German state itself, and examine a society on the edge of despair, a military in a position of last resort, and leaders who were no longer in control of the instruments of power they themselves created. Towards the end of the summer of 1918, the German leadership knew the truth, although they were unwilling to state it aloud. The war was lost. The failure of the spring offensive had exhausted Germany's last reserves of experienced troops. Casualties among elite stormtrooper units were irreplaceable. New recruits were younger, less trained, and increasingly demoralized. Meanwhile, the Allies were growing stronger by the day. American divisions arrived not as isolated reinforcements, but as entire armies. Their presence freed British and French units to rest, reorganize, and rearm. For the first time since 1914, the Allies possessed both numerical and material superiority across the front. German intelligence reports were bleak. There was no prospect of a decisive victory, only a prolonged retreat under pressure. While soldiers fought and retreated in France, conditions inside Germany deteriorated rapidly. The British naval blockade, tightened over the course of the war, had starved the country of food and raw materials. Civilians endured years of rationing. By 1918, malnutrition was widespread. The turnip winter of 1916-17 had already left deep scars, and conditions never fully recovered. Children were underweight. Disease spread easily. Mortality rates rose. Faith in leadership eroded. The promise that sacrifice would bring victory rang hollow. Workers went on strike. Demonstrations broke out in major cities. Political radicals gained influence, inspired in part by the Russian Revolution. The German state was cracking under the strain. The breaking point came not on land, but at sea. In October 1918, Germany's naval command ordered the High Seas Fleet to prepare for a final, all-or-nothing battle against the British Royal Navy. To the admirals, it was a matter of honor. To the sailors, it was madness. They knew the war was lost. They knew the fleet could not win. And they knew they were being sent to die for symbolism, not strategy. Mutiny erupted. Sailors refused orders. Red flags were raised. Revolutionary councils formed in port cities like Kiel and Wilhelmshaven.
The mutiny spread with astonishing speed.
Within days, Germany was no longer merely losing a war. It was experiencing a revolution. As unrest spread, Germany's political leadership panicked. The generals, most notably Erich Ludendorff, sought a way out. But they did so with a calculation that would poison Germany's future. They advised the government to seek an armistice based on President Wilson's 14 points. Crucially, they insisted that civilian politicians handle the negotiations. This was not generosity. It was self-preservation. By transferring responsibility to a new civilian government, the military leadership hoped to escape blame for defeat. It was a fateful decision. On November 9, 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated the throne and fled into exile in the Netherlands. The German Empire collapsed almost overnight.
A republic was proclaimed.
2 days later, on November 11, 1918, at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns fell silent. The First World War was over. To many German soldiers, the armistice was incomprehensible. They had not been driven from Germany. Enemy troops did not occupy their homeland. Many units were still on foreign soil. How, then, could Germany have lost? This question mattered more than any battlefield outcome. According to later memoirs, soldiers returned home stunned to find revolution, hunger, and political chaos, and no clear explanation for defeat. Into this vacuum stepped a dangerous myth. The Dolchstoßlegende, the stab-in-the-back legend, claimed that Germany's army had been undefeated in the field, betrayed by politicians, socialists, and internal enemies.
It was false, but it was powerful,
and it would endure. The peace negotiations that followed would transform defeat into humiliation. At the Paris Peace Conference, Germany was excluded from meaningful participation. The terms were dictated, not negotiated. The Treaty of Versailles imposed territorial losses, military restrictions, and crushing reparations. Most controversially, it included the War Guilt Clause, declaring Germany solely responsible for the conflict. For many Germans, this was unbearable. They had suffered. They had lost millions, and now they were told they alone were to blame. The bitterness hardened into identity. When historians examine this chain of events, they often focus on Versailles, or the revolution, or the collapse of morale. But step back far enough, and the thread leads to something quieter.
A telegram.
A calculated message sent in January 1917, designed to keep America out of Europe by turning it against Mexico.
It failed.
Instead, it ensured that when Germany finally reached the edge of endurance, there would be no escape. The Zimmermann telegram did not cause Germany's defeat, but it ensured that defeat would be total, decisive, and inescapable. And it ensured that the peace that followed would be fragile, resentful, and unstable. We will explore the long shadow of that decision, how a single telegram helped shape the interwar world, and how its consequences reached far beyond 1918. Wars do not finish when guns fall silent. Warfare, or armed conflict, can be. They conclude when the causes of the conflict have been eliminated. In November of 1918, the gunfire ended. But the energies released by the First World War did not evaporate into a peaceful world.
They hardened. They adapted. They waited.
The Zimmermann telegram, a former secret contingency plan written in diplomatic cipher, had never been known merely to involve the United States in a European war. It had changed the very architecture of power in the world. It had shifted the terms of wartime justification, Allied morality, and security thinking within a global village. The echo would resonate far longer than anyone involved could have imagined. Before 1917, the United States was a great power in potential, not practice. It possessed industrial strength and continental security, but it had avoided permanent entanglement in European affairs. After the war, that illusion was gone. America emerged from World War I wealthier, stronger, and more influential than any other nation. Its factories had expanded. Its banks held Allied debt. Its military had learned the mechanics of modern war. But its political soul was conflicted. President Wilson believed the war had proven that isolation was impossible. Peace, he argued, required cooperation, transparency, and collective security. The League of Nations was his answer to the problem the Zimmermann telegram had exposed. Secret diplomacy in a connected world was a recipe for catastrophe. Ironically, the United States would not join the League. War weariness, fear of foreign commitments, and partisan politics pulled America back toward isolation. Yet it could not fully retreat. The country had crossed a psychological threshold. From now on, the United States would be involved in global outcomes whether it wanted to be or not. The telegram had ensured that. In Germany, the Zimmermann telegram faded from public discussion after the war, overshadowed by defeat, revolution, and Versailles. But its deeper implications lingered. German leaders had learned that diplomacy alone could not overcome material imbalance. They had learned that provoking the United States was catastrophic. But they also absorbed a more dangerous conclusion. That next time, America must be neutralized early. This belief would shape German strategic thinking in the 1930s and 1940s. It fed into efforts to avoid a two-front war, to strike decisively, and to prevent prolonged conflict that allowed industrial giants to mobilize. The lesson was not restraint.
It was urgency.
The trauma of defeat, intensified by the sense that victory had slipped away because of outside intervention, created a mindset obsessed with speed, shock, and preemption. The telegram had taught Germany that delay was fatal. The Zimmermann telegram also revealed something fundamentally new about warfare. Wars were no longer decided solely by armies. They were decided by messages,
By cables.
by intercepted communications,
By intelligence services operating far from the front lines.
by public opinion shaped not just by events, but by revelations. Room 40's interception was not a battlefield triumph. It was an information victory, and it demonstrated how power in the modern age flowed through invisible networks. Future conflicts would be shaped by this lesson.
Signals intelligence. Cryptography. Espionage.
Psychological operations. The telegram was an early warning of an information age of warfare, where secrecy could be shattered and perception could move nations faster than armies. When Wilson justified America's entry into the war, he framed it as a defense of principles rather than territory.
Democracy. Sovereignty. International norms.
This framing mattered. It established a pattern in which wars would increasingly be sold not just as necessary, but as righteous. Conflicts would be justified not only by threats, but by values. This, too, was a legacy of the telegram. Germany's proposal to Mexico was seen not merely as hostile, but as immoral, a violation of trust and stability. It allowed Wilson to claim moral clarity where previously there had been ambiguity. Future wars would follow this template. Moral framing would become a strategic asset. The Zimmermann telegram did not prove that Germany was uniquely aggressive, or that Mexico was a genuine threat, or that America had been innocent until provoked. What it proved was more unsettling. It proved that in a tightly connected world, actions taken in secrecy can trigger consequences far beyond their intended scope. Zimmermann believed he was managing risk. He was accelerating collapse. The German leadership believed they were controlling escalation. They were widening it. The British believed they were revealing a threat. They were reshaping global alignment. And America believed it was responding to provocation. It was stepping into a role it would never fully leave. If you trace the lines forward from January 1917, they lead not only to April 1917 and America's declaration of war. They lead to 1919 and Versailles.
To the fragile interwar years.
To the rise of extremist movements fueled by resentment and fear. To a Second World War where intelligence, alliances, and global reach mattered more than ever. They lead to a world in which neutrality became nearly impossible. And they lead to a modern understanding of war as something that begins long before the first shot is fired. History often remembers dramatic moments, declarations, invasions, explosions. But the Zimmermann telegram reminds us that some of the most consequential decisions are made quietly, by people who believe they are acting rationally within systems they only partially understand. It was not a reckless message.
It was a calculated one.
That is what makes it so dangerous. The telegram did not force America into war on its own, but it removed America's last reason to stay out. It collapsed the space between hesitation and action. It turned observation into involvement. After World War I, the world tried to pretend it could return to how things had been.
It could not.
Global war had become a shared responsibility. Distance had lost its protective power. Messages could cross oceans in hours, and be intercepted along the way. The Zimmermann telegram was not the loudest cause of America's entry into the war.
But it was the clearest. And clarity, once achieved, cannot be undone.
In the end, the telegram's greatest legacy is not found in borders redrawn or battles won. It is found in a question that still haunts modern diplomacy. In a connected world, can any action remain local? The answer, as 1917 demonstrated, is no. A message written in Berlin, intended for Mexico City, intercepted in London, and published in Washington reshaped the fate of millions. The war that followed would end empires, redraw continents, and define a century. All because someone assumed no one was listening.